Air travel chaos is continuing as thousands of flights were delayed or canceled this past holiday weekend. This is a result of many different factors, such as airline layoffs and therefore short staffing. Now, last week, Senator Bernie Sanders proposed to fine airlines for these cancellations and delays, including $55,000 per passenger.
Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg said he hasn't seen all the math come back on the proposal. Let's take a look.
How many of Senator Sanders' calls to action are actively being considered? Things like requiring you to refund passengers for flights that are delayed for more than an hour.
So first of all, just to be very clear, air traffic control staffing issues do not explain the majority of the delays and cancellations we've been seeing. But when there is an issue and as an aftershock from COVID, we have seen some impacts on staffing. We're working proactively and engaging the airlines to make sure that we're collaborating on that. A number of issues that we have seen appear to be related to the phenomenon of airlines letting airlines or pilots or sometimes even pushing pilots into early retirement. And I think that's a source of frustration for the public because, of course, lots of taxpayer money went to these airlines precisely in order to keep people on the job and in order to keep those airlines running in a resilient way. So when the demand came back, they would be ready to respond. These are the kinds that we're issues that we're monitoring. You mentioned a letter from Senator Sanders. I saw it, gave him a call. We've talked about some of his ideas. Haven't seen all of the math come back on some of those proposals. But what I will say is we do have a lot of authorities for ensuring that passengers are protected. As a matter of fact, earlier we issued the largest ever fines against airlines that failed to provide prompt refunds for passengers that they're entitled to. And we're going to continue making sure that the rules are followed and look to expand our toolkit whenever that's appropriate.
Research Director at the American Economic Liberties Project, Matt Stoller, joins us now to weigh in. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yep, thanks for joining us. So, Matt, I've seen you express your thoughts on this online. You said if you want to know Biden's problem, consider that Pete Buttigieg is an unmitigated catastrophe at the Department of Transportation. This might be one of the only things you and I agree on. There's no criticism at all of his tenure on the Hill or within partisan media. The Dem political machine has no feedback loop to reality. So talk more about what you see as the deficiencies. And again, I absolutely agree with Mayor Pete suddenly upgraded to nation's foremost expert and head of transportation.
Yeah, so to give you a sense, I mean, there's problems with how Secretary Buttigieg is operating, and then there's also structural problems with the airlines, which are really, it's an industry in crisis. But what's effectively happened is that the airlines consolidated over the last 20 years. So there's four main trunk airlines that control 80% of flights, and then they screw passengers. In this particular case, they have been committing fraud, because they weren't supposed to do this when they got their big bailouts during COVID, but then they laid off a bunch. They effectively laid off a bunch of their workforce. And then when demand for air travel came back, they didn't have the capacity to service all of those customers. But instead of just scheduling flights they knew they could service, they scheduled a lot more flights that they knew they couldn't service, leading to all of these cancellations that took place right before the flights. And that is sort of a form of fraud, right? To take money for services that you know you cannot deliver. Right. Now, to move to Secretary Buttigieg for a second, because that's a pretty bold statement that I made, but the DOT, the Department of Transportation, has pretty broad authority over the airlines, and they're the only ones that have authority over the airlines. Like everybody else, the state attorney generals or consumers are preempted, right? It's just the Secretary of the Department of Transportation. But in the early 2010s, to give you a sense of how little he has enforced any sort of rules, we had about 50 enforcement orders a year against airlines. Under Trump, that dropped to about 10 to 20 a year. Last year, there were 4 enforcement orders. This is under Secretary Buttigieg, after the airline simply refused to give refunds, cash refunds that they were legally obligated to do over COVID. And then this year, there have been like 2 or 3 enforcement orders, which is a record low in an industry in crisis. And so when Secretary Buttigieg says something like, "Oh, we've given a record fine," What he means is they fined Air Canada $25 million for openly saying, we are not going to follow the law when it comes to refunds. They just said, we're not going to follow it. So they issued a $25 million fine, negotiated it down to $2 million. There has been $10 to $20 billion of canceled flights that the airlines have simply not returned. They've not returned money to customers, even though they are legally obligated to do so. And so what we need is a Secretary of Transportation who is actually going to take his job seriously of making sure that airlines don't commit fraud. And then we need to really rethink how we have this structured airline industry in the first place, because it's pretty clear that it's not actually delivering good, reliable air service for the American public.
You know, I think that is a pretty compelling argument. I'm glad you actually reminded us that we did bail them out. We did bail out the airline industries during COVID, because
something I was absolutely and utterly against, because I knew you bail the industry-specific bailouts always go this way,
right?
Where and well, maybe you can speak to this, Matt. Where we think, okay, we're going to give them this money, and then they're going to do. We're going to say don't lay people off, et cetera, and then they find some creative way, or maybe even a legal way to do it, given we gave them this money.
I mean, the quickest way to incense me is to remind me some taxpayer dollars of mine went to something that's moving ineffectively. So I'm glad you gave us the reminder.
And my understanding, Matt, is that they laid off or they pushed into retirement rather the pilots, and it's difficult to just hire back up to what you would need to be at full capacity to handle all these flights, because you can't just, there's actually somewhat quite cumbersome minimum hours for how many flights you take before you can before you can be a pilot flying on their own, that kind of thing.
Well, I also just don't want to pay, right? I mean, that's a significant part of it. But let me push back a little bit on the anti-bailout sentiment, right? Because airlines from the very beginning have always been taxpayer supported, and they have always been supported by a whole bunch of public infrastructure, airports, air traffic controllers. There's just a lot of, fuel depots and things like that. And we just have a choice. And we had this choice after 9/11 when they got a bailout. They had this choice after 2020 during COVID when we got a bailout, which is, do we want a national air system? And most people do. And if you don't want a national air system, if you don't want to be able to fly places, then you don't need to have public support of an airline industry. We've always chosen to have an airline industry because we want to be able to fly places. And I think that's generally a good choice. The problem is not that we have public support for this infrastructure, because we have public support for almost every transportation infrastructure, whether we pretend that taxpayers are not involved or not. The problem here is that we don't regulate the system like it's a public national resource.
Okay.
Instead, we offer lots of public subsidies and capacity to these institutions. And then we say, go and make as much money as you can. And that's not how we used to regulate these systems, but it's how we've been regulating these systems since the late 1970s, and it's kind of gotten worse. So this is not a sort of an argument against having a national airline system, which is really what people mean when they say we don't want any bailouts. It's for having a national system, but one that is regulated like what airlines are, which is a public utility.
Okay,
well,
so I get it.
Let me further push back on that and get your response to that. I would consider the government response, the government air travel related response to 9/11 to be among the most catastrophic policy mistakes ever made by the federal government in terms of the security measures, TSA, all of that stuff that contribute massively, based on my understanding, to our current problem. They slow down flights. They make flying much less efficient. It costs money. Running this enormous bureaucracy, has not ever been shown whatsoever to actually make air travel any safer whatsoever. It's just a stupid thing we do and have done for 20 years. So that makes me afraid of giving the government more regulatory authority over airlines, because what they have done with that is some of the most stupid decisions ever made by policymakers.
But to Matt's point, we do already have this system in place. We currently have this. We have it.
Right.
We already have it. So there does need to be something done in terms of our government and supporting them. And I think what Matt is saying is the issue is not that they put the money into trying to support this system at a time when they would have needed so it didn't crash. It's the fact that they put the money there, but then they failed to properly regulate it and ensure that our money was put to good use and that we're not dealing with the exact same problems that we put the money in to prevent. So I think the issue is on Buttigieg and poor leadership is what you're saying, right, Matt? If I understand correctly.
Right. I mean, there's two. That's right. There's basically two problems. One is that Secretary Buttigieg is a weak leader who doesn't do his job. But we've had serious problems with secretaries of transportation going back to 1978.
Right.
The other problem is that we have not made a choice about how to organize a national air system. We all agree that we want a national air system, right? And if you want a national air system, then it is going to be structured by the government. That is just the way that these things have to happen because it needs lots of public infrastructure. It's always been subsidized in various ways. The question is, how do you actually regulate a system to make sure that people have like a pretty reliable air system? It has reasonable security measures. And I think that I agree with you that a lot of the security measures are foolish or counterproductive. And often the government choices have been poor over the last 30 or 40 years. But the question isn't, well, let's get rid of all of that. Let's get rid of all government involvement, because that's really an argument for not having an air system at all. That's an argument for not being able to fly places. The question is, how do we actually structure a system that has reliable air service to most places in the country? Because, in a lot of places in the country, you can't get air service anymore, and particularly in smaller towns, non-trunk routes. I mean, I live in DC, so it's pretty easy to get places, but most places in this country, you can't. This is all a function of regulatory choices to allow how we fly and the fees that we're charged and all of the routes that is now made. Those decisions are made on Wall Street in New York in collusion with sort of like junior government officials like Pete Buttigieg. And I don't think that that's the way we should make these decisions. I think we should make these decisions through our democratic institutions, through Congress, through regulators, and have a public utility system that works for all of us, instead of one that just works for some people in Wall Street, and instead of the alternative, the sort of let's get the government out, which is not having an air system at all. And those are really the choices.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for sharing your perspective. We appreciate it, as always.
Hey, thanks a lot.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.